Good morning. Thanks for joining us on our live stream, and I hope you're doing well. I do want to take the opportunity to wish everybody a happy National Relaxation Day weekend. In fact, Relaxation Day was yesterday, and so I guess it's a belated happy Relaxation Day. But if that's a holiday that you and your family observe, if that's something that you do, then certainly from my family to yours, happy National Relaxation Day. You know, maybe if you're like me, you found out about this holiday a little bit late. In fact, I found out about National Relaxation Day right before I went to bed. And immediately, I was just filled with a bunch of regret, thinking what could have been, what should have been, if I'd only known that yesterday, August 15th, was National Relaxation Day. If you didn't get a chance to take in the festivities, which I assume is just a lot of taking of naps and watching Netflix and whatever people do on National Relaxation Day, then maybe you want to just plan another day, maybe sometime this week or in the near future, where you get to really observe something that I think will probably become really popular in the general population across the country. So again, happy belated National Relaxation Day. I hope you're doing well. I hope that things are going well in your life. I know a lot of us, there's just a lot going on in the world right now. Some of us are facing different challenges. We're going through any number of things, and right now, well, really all the time, but specifically the time we're in, we're really doing our best to look to the scriptures for answers. And if you're joining us for the first time, maybe someone sent you this link, maybe a family member or a friend or a neighbor, and we're just so excited that you took the time to be part of this journey with us. Last week, I started a collection of talks that we're calling Plot Twist, and we talked about this. There's just this whole idea that all good stories at one point or another have a plot twist in them. Things are going one way, then all of a sudden they go in a completely different direction. And we see the same is true, or especially true, in Jesus's teachings. Jesus was a master storyteller. He was super good at kind of taking us on a journey, and just when you think he's going somewhere, he takes us in a totally different direction, usually going on an inward journey to look at the things of our hearts and where we are in our spiritual lives and in our relationship with God. So wherever you are, on the spiritual journey, on the canvas of faith. We're just excited that you're here with us, you're connecting with us. If you're watching this live right now, take a moment and just throw in the chat, where you're watching from, which part of the city, if you're in Kansas City or Lawrence, which state you're in, which part of the country you're in. If you're outside of the United States, throw in the chat where you're watching from right now, or just specifically which room in the house you're watching from. Either way, but throw that in there, man. We're just so grateful that you're taking the time to connect with us. Okay, just a little bit of a review before we jump in. So in our first talk, so last Sunday, Jesus was teaching about this lost son. So this younger son who asked his father for an inheritance while the father was still alive. That creates a little bit of friction in the relationship. So he asks for an inheritance, and then he takes the inheritance and he squanders it in a faraway land. And so that's kind of the teaching, and what we see in that is each one of us, every person at one point or another in their lives is that lost son, is that lost daughter, and man, we're all in this together. Each one of us has to come to our senses. We have to change our hearts. We have to make a decision to come back to the Father. Some of us have done that many, many years or even decades ago. Some of us have done that, and then we've wandered again, and the invitation is still there for you. Come back home. Come back to the Father, because he wants to throw a party for you. He wants to celebrate. And then there's those of us who we're still out there, and we need to have that coming to our senses moment where we look at what the world offers, and we look at just all the things that we are doing and involved in, and we compare it to what God offers us. And it's kind of like, man, life is so much better having a relationship with God, having a clear purpose, a clear direction in my life, having a foundation to build my life, my relationships on. And so that's part of the teaching. But then in a plot twist, Jesus focuses, first of all, on the younger brother, but then he focuses on the older brother, the brother that was already in the household, the brother that wasn't on a journey anymore, and he was part of the family with the father. And the point that he's trying to help us see there is even those of us who've been at this for a while now, we're kind of veterans at this whole Christianity thing, we still have to be mindful of having the exact same heart that we had at first. And in fact, at times, the longer we're in the household, the longer we're at this, the more challenging it can be to have that initial heart that we had when we first came back to the Father. There's times where we struggle with the same types of challenges, at times the same sins, that the younger brother struggled with. We can have our own version of pride. We can have our own version of entitlement. And the longer we're at things, we talked a little bit about how envy and disappointment can really wreak havoc in our hearts. At times we can be bitter. At times we can look at how things have gone and not feel great about where we are versus where we'd want to be. And the message for those of us who are already in the household of faith is we've got to be weary, we've got to be aware of making sure that our sinful nature doesn't become too sophisticated. Maybe it's not as obvious as it once was. When we first came in, man, our sin went in front of us. It was obvious to everyone around us that there were things we needed to change. But sometimes we can get a little more sophisticated, a little more refined in the sinful nature and the things that are lurking beneath the surface. And things like pride, things like envy, things like entitlement, they're just as real today, years, decades later, as they were when we first came back to the Father. And there's a challenge in there for us to acknowledge those things, to be humble about those things. We're needed to get the help from people around us to make sure that we're continuing to repent and change and grow and continuing to come to our senses, even if we've been in the household of faith for, again, a while, years or even decades. Okay, so we're going to continue in our series. We're going to open up in our second talk here. Before we get into the scriptures, if you would, let's just pray together for our study. Let's pray. Father, it's great to be connecting online, and it's so encouraging, God, to be able to go to your word for insights, for inspiration. We're so grateful that your word is a light to our feet. It gives us an ultimate destination point, a North Star for how we can live our lives, for the heart that you want us to have, ultimately to have the relationship with you that we need and the relationships with others that we also need in this life. I pray that our study today, as we look at Jesus' teachings, as we look at some of the things he draws out, I pray that wherever we're at right now, that we'll see ourselves in your word, but we'll also see some steps that we can take to grow, to change, to get unstuck, to move closer to you. We love you. We pray this in your son's name. Amen. Okay. So we're going to be in Luke 16. So last week we were in Luke 15, and we're going to be going to the next chapter. So this is the Gospel of Luke in the New Testament, one of the 4 gospel accounts. Luke himself was a physician, was a great writer, and he drew out a few things that we talked about last week. We're going to kind of be looking at some new things and some different things this morning. Luke 16, let's read together beginning in verse 1. It says this: Jesus told his disciples, "There was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, 'What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be a manager any longer.' The manager said to himself, 'What shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do. When I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their homes.' So he called in each one of his master's debtors. He asked the first, 'How much do you owe the master?' 900 gallons of oil,' he replied. The manager told him. 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 450. Then he asked the second, 'How much do you owe?' 1,000 bushels of wheat,' he replied. He told him, 'Take your bill and make it 800. Okay. So the story begins. This is Jesus telling a story. Again, master storyteller. It's a parable. So there's physical examples, but there's always spiritual meanings that are attached to it. And this story begins with a wealthy business owner and a money manager who works for him who's been wasting his resources. And so the owner calls the manager in and gives them a talking to, and then gives them his pink slip. And we see that basically this manager is about to be out on the street. And so it's interesting because the message here, or the wording here that Jesus is using to describe this manager, this manager who is wasting the wealth, wasting the owner's wealth, is the same vernacular. It's the same wording that was used to describe the younger son that we talked about last week when he went off to a distant country. So he had these resources and he was wasting, he was squandering it. He wasn't using them properly. So what we see here is that things are not going so great for this manager. But all of a sudden, he comes up with a fairly savvy plan. And so he begins to take inventory, and he calls in the folks that owe the owner, his boss, that they owe him money. He calls them in. He calls a couple of them in. And Jesus is using some really kind of fitting examples here, agricultural examples, which would be common in the first century and in that culture. So he's using some examples that economically would make sense. Olive oil and bushels of wheat. The first man comes in and he owes 900 gallons of olive oil, which would have worked out to about 3 years of wages. So that's quite a bit of a debt. And so the manager lowers it by half from 900 gallons to 450 gallons. And so now he's on a roll, and he calls in another guy. And he says, so how much do you owe? And the guy's like, well, I owe 1,000 bushels of wheat, which would have been maybe 8 to 9 years of wages for a worker anyways. And the manager lowers this debt to 800 bushels. And so, to no one's surprise, these debtors were okay with the plan. They're like, oh, you're going to lower it by half? Oh, you're going to lower it by 200? Okay, where do I sign off on this? I'm good with this. And so the manager essentially used his shrewdness to create a plan that was beneficial for those guys, but also beneficial for him. On one hand, they got their debts lowered significantly, but then in return, the manager now had some friends that he could come a-calling on when he had a time of need, which he knew was coming up fairly soon. Okay, so we look at Jesus' teaching, and as we pause here, seems kind of straightforward, a little bit of an open shut kind of thing here. We know Jesus, he's all about, doing the right thing. And so clearly the teaching here is going to be about how we can't be dishonest, or how we got to make sure that we're not, so focused on money. Or, maybe the teaching here is that, we got to do our best in everything, even in the workplace, in the marketplace. We got to be, the best we can be for God. Maybe one of those things. Those are the straightforward types of things that we think could maybe come out of a story like this. We're cruising along. Everything seems to make sense. And then Jesus flips the script once again. And as we've said, every good story has a plot twist, and every good storyteller knows when to insert the plot twist for the maximum amount of tension. And that's exactly what Jesus did. Let's keep reading verse 8. It says, the master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. This is crazy because this was the same manager just a few verses earlier who was being condemned for stealing, for being dishonest. And now all of a sudden he's being commended for his shrewdness and for creating a fairly savvy plan. And in a plot twist that no one could have seen coming, especially that initial audience. Some of us, we've read scriptures like this, so we're like, hey, I know what's going to happen. I know all about these plot twists. I've been in church for a while now, but put yourself in the position of somebody who's hearing this for the first time, or perhaps some of us even this morning, or as you're connecting online for, at a later time, you've never heard this story. this is quite a plot twist. It's not necessarily where you'd see this story going. Instead of being condemned, this money manager is being commended. You know, Jesus is always operating on several levels. And yeah, he was talking about money. And yeah, we shouldn't be dishonest. We should have integrity in the way that we deal with people around us, or with money, in our jobs. And so there's no contradiction in any of that. But let's keep reading in verse 9, and we'll kind of see where Jesus is going with this plot twist. And then we'll kind of come out the other side with some application for our lives. Verse 9, I tell you, so this is Jesus speaking now, and as he's kind of finishing up his teaching after talking about the manager. Verse 9, I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. And whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So if you've not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you've not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? Verse 13, no one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. The Pharisees, this is the same religious folk that were kind of hovering around the earlier chapter, or last week when we were looking at the story of the lost son. The Pharisees, the religious leaders, the church folk, the Pharisees who loved money heard all this and were sneering at Jesus. He said to them, you are the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of others, but God knows your hearts. What people value highly is detestable in God's sight. Okay, this teaching here, these few verses are incredibly rich with meaning, particularly for those of us who are either trying to follow Jesus, like we're his disciples, or we're on this journey of even trying to know more about that. And that's the heart we want to have. If you're somebody who is following Jesus or wants to follow Jesus, this is gold right here in terms of some of the priorities and the heart that Jesus wants all of his followers to have. So let's unpack it for the next couple minutes. Okay, so Jesus is teaching about this dishonest manager, and he inserts a plot twist. Instead of him being condemned, instead he was commended. And in verse 8, we kind of see where he's going with this. In verse 8, he says, the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are people of the light. And so out of the gate, we see that Jesus' primary focus, not his only focus, but his primary focus is on spiritual things, is on eternal things. And the more you see Jesus' ministry and his teaching, the more you hear him, the more you realize that down here on earth, a lot of folks are playing spiritual checkers, and Jesus is over here playing spiritual chess. He's operating on a far grander scale. He's thinking and teaching on things that a lot of folks aren't even really considering in their day-to-day lives. And so he's talking about our spiritual lives, and he gives some spiritual teachings that have application for our spiritual lives. Okay, so Jesus didn't miss an opportunity to address the hearts, particularly of the religious folks who were listening in. And so he did make spiritual points, but then he also did talk about money. And so with that said, as the plot changes, as there's a plot twist, we see the manager going from losing his livelihood and being out on the street to being commended by the owner. And the thrust of Jesus' teaching in all this, the main thrust, was that, simply put, the people in this world, the world that we currently live in, will often go to great lengths. They'll be incredibly shrewd. They'll come up with great plans to take care of their own physical well-being in the here and now. And Jesus is saying to his followers, he's saying, look at this dude here. Look at this shrewd dude. That rhymes. Okay, so we'll go with that. Look at this shrewd dude who, when faced with a really challenging situation, got really innovative really quickly. And Jesus is saying, that's what most folks in the world we live in the physical world we live in, that's what they'll do to take care of their physical well-being. Saying, but then as my followers, as those who care about not just this life, but the life to come, you should take this same level of interest. You should have this same savvy. You should have the same shrewdness and wisdom in planning forward for the next life, for spiritual things, for eternity. If that's how much effort people are putting into the here and now, how much more should the people of God, the people of the light, put into the time that's going to come, the next life, our eternal destiny? He's talking about us having the same shrewdness in our spiritual lives as many have in their physical lives. You know, when you think about it, man, when it comes to our money, when it comes to, our future, we often go to some pretty great lengths. We put a lot of effort and time into this. It's interesting in the world we live in, even folks who don't have a spiritual, desire, maybe they're not Christians, maybe they don't even believe in God. It's quite uncommon to see folks just open to getting other people's advice in important areas of their life. Like very rarely, without the Bible and without direction in our lives, very rarely do you see someone reaching out and say, "Hey, can I get some help, some advice on my marriage?" It's not a common thing you hear, at the pub or in the locker room from guys. Very rarely is someone reaching out saying, "Hey, can I get some advice about my parenting, my relationship with my son, my relationship with my daughter?" Not so common. And yet, what is common in the world we live in, whether you have faith or not, is to get plenty of advice and plenty of input on your portfolio. In fact, there's whole industries dedicated to folks who will come in and sit down with you. I see them at the coffee shop all the time, and they're helping folks plan forward, helping folks make the right determinations for their retirement, to do the best they can with their investments. The simple point is when it comes to our money, man, we could be shrewd. Man, we're open-minded. Man, we're going to do whatever it takes. And some of us probably are more savvy than others, and there's folks who've done a really good job. There's probably some of us who, just as an aside, probably should get more help in those areas and be more diligent in our financial planning. But when you think about it, because that's important to people, because that's where people's treasure is, that's where their heart follows. I want to throw a date up for you. The date is September 29th, 2008. September 29th, 2008. I'm not sure who is, just off the top of your head, if you know what happened that day. Maybe some of you do, some of you don't. But September 29th, 2008 was the day where the stock market crashed. It was the day that the Dow fell by an astonishing 777 point something percent. It was the greatest single day loss in Dow Jones history up until that point. And during that period, really a period of about a year and a half, which is referred to as the Great Recession. So that whole time in 2008 is referred to as there was the Great Depression. This was now the Great Recession. That time, in about a year and a half, they say that about $8 trillion in wealth was lost. And, that had just a challenging effect on the housing market. Some of us probably remember that in 2008. That year, there were over 23 million foreclosures in the country, which amounted to about 1 in every 50 or so households, defaulted on their mortgage and foreclosed. There were also a lot of folks who were affected by the ripples through the economy. Some lost their homes entirely, others lost their jobs, some lost a good deal of their savings. For Clarissa and I, in 2008, we had scrounged up enough money to purchase our first home, and we were set to close that fall. And it was just this really interesting thing where we went to bed, one night, and we woke up the next morning, and our house was worth less than what we paid for it. And I know there's a lot of stories like that. This Great Recession had an incredible impact on America, but really on the world as a whole. When all said and done, the pain that was experienced by millions of people around the country, around the world, the simplest explanation, Congress held what seemed to be never-ending witnesses coming through, and sessions where people were testifying and trying to get to the bottom of this financial crisis. Papers were written. Hollywood did movies on it. But when all's said and done, if you really boil down, $8 trillion of wealth lost, lots of folks affected by losing their homes, losing their savings. When you break it all down, the simplest explanation is this. Some really, really wealthy people hired some really, really smart people, and together they created a system for generating wealth for themselves that was as complex as it was immoral. There was no way that the system that was being created could be sustained over a long period of time. It went as long as it could, but it was specifically designed to create a maximum amount of wealth for those specific people. I know that's a really simple reading of it, and there was a lot of factors, and there's a lot of smarter people than me that can say, yes, it was also this, and all the forecasts and all that kind of stuff. But simply put, really rich people hired really smart people, and they came up with a plan that was complex and immoral. You know, Jesus says this, he says, the people of this world are shrewd in dealing with their own kind. And it's interesting because when faced with the opportunity to make money, to plan forward, to invest in our own future, friends, we're not short on ideas, are we? People in our world, we're not short on creativity. We're not short on being wise or shrewd when it comes to investing in the physical aspects of the world we live in. The shrewd manager was all about this. He was all about the hustle and the grind. He was all about doing whatever he could to plan a better future for himself in this life. And the plot twist, as Jesus tells his story, as he looks over at you and he looks over at me, the plot twist, he says, now you have to be just as shrewd when you plan for the next life. You have to be just as shrewd, put just as much creativity, and have just as much interest in planning forward for eternity as folks did in the banking sector, as folks do in the world we live in. All the attention that people put towards their portfolio and their retirement and their 401k and all that kind of stuff, you need to learn from that and put that same level of detail and intention into eternity, into your spiritual lives. You know, Matthew 6, verse 21, I referenced it. Jesus frames it this way. He says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. It's obvious when you look around the world that we live in that so many are clearly invested in having their best life here on this earth, in the kingdom of this world or the kingdoms of this world. And so that's where their heart is. That's where their energy is put. But Jesus wants his followers in a twisting of the plot to learn from that and put our attention into the next life. Okay, a couple of things that I think are good for us to consider as we think about application for our own lives. The first thing, and the first just kind of concept or thought that I want to kind of shine a light on is our allegiance. Jesus is really focusing on where our allegiance is. If you're a disciple, a follower of Jesus, your allegiance is super important. Jesus says this, he says, no one can serve two masters. You'll love one and you'll hate the other. No one can have two kings. No one can have membership in two kingdoms. And the question that's being posed to all of us as we listen to Jesus' teaching is simply this: is your allegiance to God and his eternal kingdom, or is it to the here and the now and the various kingdoms of the world? Things like accomplishment, things like our good name, things like noble causes, things like our wealth and our money, our reputation, our comfort, all of these things at some point or another need to be disrupted if our allegiance is first and foremost to God and to the next life. We can't live like everybody else, and we can't have the priorities of everyone else. Jesus is not saying that we shouldn't be wise and shrewd with our money, but he's saying how much more wise and how much more shrewd should we be in our allegiance and our planning towards God's kingdom. You know, if you're a disciple, what gets you excited? What gets you out of bed in the morning and gets you excited in this life? What hurts your heart the most? What do you think about through your day? The answers to those questions says a lot about where our allegiance is. Is our allegiance to the kingdoms of this world, or is it to the eternal kingdom that Jesus came to establish and wants us to be a part of? How much attention do you give to what's going on in the physical world? all that's going to perish, all that's temporary, that's fading, versus the spiritual world, God's kingdom, which will endure forever. How much time do you give to the current news cycle or what's happening on social media versus prayer and Bible study, which promote a relationship with God and relationships with others that do go into eternity? In an election year, can we go there? We're going to go there, okay? It's never too early to go there. It's an election year. Is your greatest allegiance to Team Red or Team Blue? Or is your allegiance to the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the King of heaven, the one who oversees the kingdom that you're a part of? Is that where your allegiance lies versus the kingdoms of this world? Jesus came to seek and save the lost, which includes each one of us at one point or another. He came to announce the great banquet and fill that banquet. Do you share that same heart? Is your allegiance to God's kingdom? You know what? The more we read Jesus' teachings, and honestly, the more you try to put this into practice in your life, the more you come up with, or you come up against this conflict. You can't serve two masters. You can't serve money and God. You can't serve the here and the now and also serve your interests for eternity. Jesus says, look at this money manager, look at his shrewdness, look at the lengths he went to. You need to have the same allegiance to God's kingdom. You know, if you're not a Christian, I really believe that this is a foundational teaching. And if you understand this, maybe you're doing some Bible studies, or I would just encourage you, if you're not, to reach out to somebody that you trust, or even put something in on the chat and somebody can connect with you. But if you're not a Christian, this is foundational in terms of becoming a Christian. It's a shifting of our priorities, a shifting of our mindset. It's having an allegiance to God and his kingdom. And then secondly, lastly, we talked about our allegiance. And then the second thing that Jesus is drawing out is our investment. You know, in Acts 17, Paul, the Apostle Paul, was preaching in Athens, Greece. And he just makes this simple point. He's on this missionary journey. So he's going to different places. He's helping people become Christians. He's preaching the message of Jesus. And he makes a simple point. He says, God is over everything in this world. In fact, God gives you your life, your breath, and everything else. Just in case you're wondering, he gives you every aspect of your life. It comes from him. Every good thing, every blessing, everything that gets you excited is from God. Your breath, the breath that you breathe in and out. As we started this talk, how many times have you breathed in and breathed out and not really thought about that? That comes from God. And then he says, and by the way, everything else. You know, this foundational belief that everything you have comes from God really shifts, and it really changes how you think about using these resources that are in your life. It creates this need or this desire to be a good steward of the things that God has given you. You know, in verse 9, Jesus makes this point. It's really simply, he says, we acquire all these things. He says, but when it is gone, when this wealth, when these things we acquire in this world are gone, meaning that at some point these things will be gone. Everything that we value now, everything that we save for, everything that we plan for, everything that we invest in the here and now will be gone at some point or another. And so the point he's making is make sure that while you have these resources, while you have time, while you have money, while you have gifts and talents in this life, use them wisely. Invest properly. Take the wisdom and the shrewdness of this money manager and now apply it to your spiritual life, so that you can invest in things to come that don't perish and that will last. You know, Luke chapter 12 in verse 33, you can jot this one down. Jesus had already been talking about money and the kingdom kind of throughout Luke's gospel here. But Luke 12 verse 33, he frames it this way. He says, sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourself that will not wear out. Again, eternal versus temporary. A treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. He says, store up for yourselves treasure in heaven. Invest wisely. Invest in eternity, not the temporary. You know, Jesus looks at you, he looks at me, he looks at our lives. He says, you've got to have the same level of effort. You've got to have the same shrewdness, the same savvy that folks put into their 401k and planning forward for the retirement. You need to invest in eternal things. Okay, I'll just say one more thing on this and we'll kind of wind our time down. I really believe that this can come off the page and come into our lives in a few ways. Our allegiance to God's kingdom, first and foremost, and investing in spiritual things. One of the best ways we can see that this is true in our hearts and in our lives is with the spirit that we have with the things that God's given us. Are we open-handed? Are we generous with the many blessings we have? Some of us, we've been blessed with financial wealth. God's given us the ability to make money and be successful in business, or perhaps it's come from family. Are you generous with what God has given you? Certainly, we talk often about the need to give to spiritual causes, that the church and otherwise, but there's also this teaching that's running throughout the Gospels of taking care of the poor, especially those who are in abject poverty, those who have the greatest of needs. Are you generous? Are you open-handed with what God's given you? Another way to kind of assess where we are in this is just the question, are we led by Jesus' mission? We want to be generous with what we have, our time, our resources, our money, our talents, our gifts. But then is Jesus' mission at the forefront of our hearts? That's one way we can tell, are we investing in eternal things? It takes time and effort to help somebody around us to become a Christian. Many of us know that because when we became Christians, it took a lot of time and a lot of effort. But are we willing to invest in that way to help other people? It takes at times us using our gifts and our talents and our abilities that otherwise would have been used for ourselves to build God's kingdom now. And that's kind of where we'll leave things today. And I just want to kind of, conclude with this one point. In Matthew 6, on the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks, and if you've been a Christian for a while, if you know the scriptures, you know how he talks about how we got to seek first God's kingdom. It's another way of saying what Jesus is saying here. We got to prioritize spiritual things. We got to put God and his kingdom ahead of ourselves and the things of this world. But it's interesting, he talks about seeking the kingdom and putting that first and seeking a righteous life, which is the life that Jesus calls us to. But when you think about kind of practically, what does that look like? Really what that is, it's one person, it's two people, it's a family, it's a household, it's a smaller group of Christians, it's the body of Christ. It's us taking all of the things that we otherwise would have used for our own benefit, that we would have invested in this world, and we're taking those same resources, our time, our money, our gifts, our talents, all that God has blessed us with, and now we're saying that is going to be used to build the eternal kingdom of God. That's where our allegiance is. There's wisdom in making sure you put food on the table for your family. There's wisdom in planning forward and thinking about the later years of your life. And obviously, we don't know how long God gives us, but there's nothing wrong with those things. But where our allegiance lies and where we invest, the shift here in Jesus' teaching, the plot twist, is that those things need to go towards God's kingdom and things that are eternal in our lives. Now, I want to ask you to imagine with me, those who are watching live in Lawrence and Kansas City, we're in this really amazing process right now of building a church, and we've been praying and fasting, and we're going to take the rest of this year to build a vision. We want to build a church that's collaborative and inclusive. We want to have an incredible impact in the different parts of our cities and our towns and our communities. But can you imagine what God could do if each one of us, hundreds of us, came together and we said, we're going to use what God's given us. We're going to put first and foremost our allegiance towards God and his kingdom, and that's a disposition of our hearts. But then secondly, we're going to use everything God's given us and we're going to invest that in building God's kingdom in this part of the world. I wonder what God could do. I don't totally know, but I know that he can go beyond what we expect, even what we imagine. And I wonder how many people in this part of the world, in our communities, in our towns, in our city, could be served? How many people who have needs right now could be served? How many lives could be changed? How many people could be renewed? How many people could come back to the Father or come to the Father for the first time in this life because we decided to invest in spiritual things. It almost is like that's God's plan all along, to use you, to use me to build his kingdom here on earth. You know, Jesus is the master storyteller, and he always incorporates these plot twists. But oftentimes the plot twist comes right to our doorstep, and it's addressing our hearts, addressing the attitudes in our hearts. And I want to encourage you to really assess where you are. If you're not a Christian, man, what a great opportunity to see God's vision for your life and take a step forward this week. But if you are a Christian, to look at where your allegiance is, to look where you've been investing, and to make sure that as you look at folks making all these investments in the physical world and in this life, that you decide to make your investments in the life to come. Thanks for connecting with us this morning. We're going to be back together again next Sunday as I conclude our plot twist series. Have a great rest of the day and have an incredible upcoming week.
I chase